Caleb watched the flames dance, orange tongues licking at the sky, where his barn used to be. The wind, a dry rasping thing, whipped the smoke into his face, carrying the scent of ruin. He didn't flinch. Grief was a cold stone in his gut, heavier than any sorrow he'd known before. The railroad men, faces hidden behind greed and the promise of progress, had come just before dusk, offered him a pittance for his land. He'd refused. Now his home was ash. He spat, the globule landing on scorched earth, a black mirror reflecting the dying light. He had nothing left, except a horse, a saddle, and a burning need. Caleb turned away from the pyre. No use dwelling on what was lost. He had a path to walk now, a debt to collect. He swung onto his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Shadow, the only living thing he could trust. Shadow snorted, sensing his master's mood. The tension coiled tight in Caleb's frame. He rode west, towards the setting sun, the fire a fading glow behind him. The land was unforgiving, scrub brush and rock, a testament to the hard life he'd chosen. He'd carved a living from this place, sweat and blood soaking into the parched soil. Now, it was all gone, stolen by men who saw only profit. Days blurred into weeks. Caleb followed the railroad tracks, a black scar across the land, a constant reminder of his loss. He slept under the stars, ate dried jerky and hardtack, and nursed his anger. He wasn't a gunslinger, not by trade, but he knew how to handle a rifle, knew the land, and knew the ways of men. He found them in a small town called Redemption, a place built on the promise of a new beginning, now tainted by the railroad's greed. They were celebrating, drinking and laughing in the saloon, flush with success. Caleb watched from across the street, his face hidden in shadow, his eyes narrowed. He recognized them. Jenkins, the foreman, a burly man with a cruel smile, and Slater, the lawyer, slick and smooth, his words as sharp as a knife. They were the ones who had delivered the offer, the ones who had overseen the burning. Caleb tied Shadow to a post and walked across the street, the dust swirling around his boots. The saloon doors swung open, and the noise spilled out into the night. He stepped inside, the sudden silence heavy in the air. Jenkins saw him first. His smile faltered, his eyes widening in recognition. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he sneered, his hand instinctively moving towards his gun. "You burned my ranch," Caleb said, his voice low and steady. Slater stepped forward, his face pale. "It was business, nothing personal." "Everything's personal," Caleb replied. Jenkins drew his gun. "You're a fool to come here." Caleb didn't move. "I came for what's mine." The saloon erupted in chaos. Men scrambled for cover, glasses shattered, and a woman screamed. Jenkins fired, the bullet whistling past Caleb's ear. Caleb drew his own rifle, the movement fluid and practiced. He fired once, twice. Jenkins crumpled to the floor, a look of surprise on his face. Slater tried to run, but Caleb was faster. He grabbed him by the collar, his grip like iron. "Where's the money?" he demanded. "The money you offered me for my land." Slater stammered. It's with the boss. He's in the next town." Caleb shoved him aside. He knew Slater was lying. The money was here somewhere. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on a strongbox behind the bar. He kicked it open, revealing stacks of bills. He grabbed the money, stuffing it into his saddlebags. It wouldn't bring back his ranch, his life. But it was something. It was a start. He turned to leave, stepping over Jenkins' body. He paused at the door, looking back at the terrified faces in the saloon. "This ain't justice," he said, "but it's what you get." He rode out of Redemption, the sound of gunfire fading behind him. He didn't know where he was going, what he would do with the money, but he knew he couldn't stay here. The land was tainted, the memories too strong, He rode through the night, the moon a silver coin in the sky. He felt no satisfaction, no sense of victory, only a deep, aching emptiness. He had taken revenge, but it hadn't filled the hole in his heart. As dawn broke, he reached a high ridge overlooking a vast empty plain. He stopped Shadow and looked out at the horizon. The land stretched out before him, endless and unforgiving. It was a land of hardship and loss, of dreams and broken promises. But it was also a land of opportunity, a place where a man could start over. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He had lost everything, but he was still alive. He still had his horse, his skills, and his will to survive. He had a choice to make. He could wallow in his grief, let his anger consume him, or he could find a new path, a new purpose. He spurred Shadow forward, riding towards the rising sun. The future was uncertain, the road ahead long and hard. But he was a survivor. He would find a way. He had to. Caleb rode for 3 days, the stolen railroad money heavy in his saddlebags, a constant, gritty reminder of what he'd lost and how he'd gained it. He skirted around settlements, distrust etched deep in his bones. He wasn't running from the law, not yet, but from the ghosts that clung to him like dust devils. On the 4th day, the sun beat down mercilessly. Shadow's gait slowed. His breathing labored. Caleb knew they needed water, and soon. He scanned the horizon, a shimmering heat haze playing tricks on his eyes. Then, he saw it. A cluster of cottonwoods, a telltale sign of water in this arid land. He urged Shadow forward, the horse responding with a renewed burst of energy. As they drew closer, the trees resolved into a small isolated town, clinging to the earth like a tenacious weed. Buildings huddled together, weathered and worn, as if exhausted by the constant sun. A single dusty street ran through its heart, lined with a general store, a blacksmith, and inevitably a saloon. Caleb dismounted in front of the saloon, the batwing doors creaking open as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and tobacco. A handful of men were scattered around the room, nursing drinks and muttering to each other in low voices. The barkeep, a gaunt man with tired eyes, wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. Caleb walked to the bar and dropped a coin. "Whiskey," he said, his voice rough from days of silence. The barkeep poured him a shot, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass. Caleb downed it in one gulp, the fiery liquid burning a path down his throat. He signaled for another, then leaned against the bar, listening to the murmur of conversations. Snippets reached him. "Stagecoach hit, east of here. Outlaws, the Blackwater gang, they say. Tough times, getting tougher." He wasn't interested in trouble. He just needed rest, water for Shadow, and a moment to gather his thoughts. But trouble, he knew, had a way of finding a man. The saloon door swung open again, cutting through the gloom. All conversation ceased. Every eye in the room turned towards the entrance. Standing there, framed by the harsh sunlight, was a woman. She was dressed in fine city clothes, a silk dress, a tailored jacket, and delicate leather boots. Clothes that were utterly out of place in this dusty, forgotten corner of the world. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a fragile strength. She looked like a wildflower blooming in a desert, beautiful but vulnerable. Caleb watched her, his senses on high alert. He knew instinctively that her arrival had just changed everything. The barkeep cleared his throat. "Can I help you, ma'am?" The woman hesitated, then spoke, her voice trembling slightly. I need to send a telegram." The barkeep nodded towards the back of the saloon. "Telegraph office is through that door, but the operator ain't here right now. Should be back later this evening." The woman's shoulders slumped. "Oh." She looked around the saloon, her eyes flitting nervously from face to face. Caleb saw the unspoken questions in her gaze. Who can I trust? Where can I go? One of the men, a burly character with a scarred face and greasy hair, grinned at her. Well now, a pretty little thing like you shouldn't be alone in a place like this. Why don't you come sit with me, and we can wait for that telegram operator together? The woman recoiled, her hand instinctively reaching for a small purse she carried. No thank you, she said, her voice barely a whisper. The man chuckled, a predatory glint in his eyes. Don't be shy, honey. I'm sure we can find something to talk about. He started to rise from his chair. Caleb had seen enough. He pushed himself away from the bar and stepped forward, his movements low and deliberate. Leave her alone, he said, his voice low and dangerous. The burly man stopped, his eyes narrowing. He looked Caleb up and down, assessing the threat. And who are you to tell me what to do? Someone who doesn't like seeing a woman harassed, Caleb replied, his gaze unwavering. The man hesitated, then shrugged. Fine, he said, backing down. But she's on her own. He spat on the floor and turned away. Caleb turned to the woman. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. Yes, thank you. I don't know what I would have done. What brings you to a place like this? Caleb asked, his curiosity piqued. My name is Eleanor, she said, ignoring his question. Eleanor Vance, and I'm looking for someone. Who? She hesitated again, then took a deep breath. My brother. His name is Thomas. He came out west a few years ago. I haven't heard from him in months. Caleb knew that the West swallowed people whole. Sometimes they reappeared, changed and hardened. Sometimes they just disappeared, leaving no trace. What was he doing out here? Caleb asked. He was working on the railroad, Eleanor said, her voice faltering. He was a surveyor. Caleb felt a jolt. The railroad. It was a connection, a thread in the tapestry of his own loss. Do you know where he was working? Caleb asked. Eleanor shook her head. Just somewhere east of here, near the Blackwater River, I think. The Blackwater River. Caleb knew that area. It was rough country, infested with outlaws and unforgiving terrain. This is dangerous country, Caleb said. Looking for someone out here is a risky proposition. I know, Eleanor said, her voice firm. But I have to try. He's all I have left. Caleb looked into her eyes and saw a flicker of the same burning need that had driven him across the plains. The need for justice, for answers, for something to cling to in the face of overwhelming loss. He knew he should walk away. He had his own path to follow, his own demons to fight. Getting involved in her search would only complicate things, draw him deeper into a world of trouble. But he couldn't. Something in her eyes, a shared sense of desperation, had reached him. He saw a reflection of his own pain in her face. He took a deep breath. I know the Blackwater country, he said. I'll help you find him. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with surprise and gratitude. You would? Why? Caleb didn't have an answer. Not one he could put into words. He just knew that he couldn't leave her to face this alone. Maybe in helping her, he could find some small measure of redemption for himself. Let's just say I owe the railroad a debt, he said, his voice low. And maybe, just maybe, this is a way to pay it back. Eleanor's gaze searched his, disbelief and hope warring within. You'd really do that? Help me? Caleb nodded once, his jaw tight. I said I would. He didn't elaborate, didn't offer false promises. He'd learned long ago that words were cheap, actions were the only currency that mattered. He turned to the barkeep. Water for my horse, and a room for the lady. He tossed a few more coins onto the counter. The barkeep, surprised by Caleb's sudden shift from silent observer to protector, nodded quickly. Right away. As the barkeep moved to fill the order, Eleanor approached Caleb. Her voice hushed. Mr. Caleb, he supplied, his eyes scanning the room, still wary of the burly man and his companions. Mr. Caleb, she continued, I don't know how to thank you, but I have some money. I can pay you for your help. Caleb frowned. I don't need your money. He wasn't a mercenary. He was doing this for reasons he didn't fully understand, reasons that had more to do with his own buried pain than with her. But I insist, Eleanor pressed, her voice laced with desperation. I need to feel like I'm contributing something. And I have another proposition, if you're willing to hear it. Caleb raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her boldness. She was more than just a delicate city flower. There was a steel core beneath her refined exterior. He led her towards a small table in the corner of the saloon, away from prying ears. They sat down, the silence stretching between them, broken only by the clinking of glasses and the low murmur of conversations. Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. This is going to sound unconventional, she began, her cheeks flushing slightly. But I'm desperate. I'm alone in a dangerous place, and I need protection. Caleb waited, his expression unreadable. I've been traveling alone since leaving St. Louis, she continued, and I've already experienced unwanted attention. I've learned that a woman traveling alone in the West is vulnerable. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I need to project an image of security. Caleb understood immediately. He'd seen it before. The way men looked at a woman traveling alone, the assumptions they made, the liberties they felt entitled to take. So, Eleanor said, her voice growing stronger, I have a proposition for you. I'll pay you a significant sum of money if you'll pretend to be my husband. Caleb stared at her, stunned. The offer was so unexpected, so audacious, that it took him a moment to process it. Pretend to be her husband? The idea was ludicrous, absurd. He chuckled, a short, harsh sound. You can't be serious. Eleanor's eyes met his, unflinching. I am. I have enough money to make it worth your while. Enough to, perhaps, rebuild what you lost. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. She knew. Somehow, she knew about his ranch, about the fire, about the railroad men. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. The offer was tempting, almost too good to be true. The money she was talking about could give him a fresh start, a chance to reclaim his life. He could buy new land, new livestock, new equipment. He could rebuild his home. But the cost was his pride, his independence, his very identity. To pretend to be someone he wasn't, to enter into a sham marriage, it was a betrayal of everything he believed in. Why me, he asked, his voice low and guarded. Why not one of the other men in this town? Eleanor looked around the saloon, her gaze lingering on the faces of the men who had been watching her. I trust you, she said, her voice soft but firm. You stood up for me. You didn't try to take advantage of me. And I see something in your eyes, a strength, a decency that I don't see in the others. Caleb looked away, uncomfortable with her praise. He didn't see himself as strong or decent. He saw himself as a broken man, consumed by anger and grief. What would this entail? He asked, his mind racing. Just acting the part, Eleanor explained. Traveling together, sharing a room, introducing ourselves as husband and wife. Nothing more. I promise. Caleb remained silent, weighing his options. The money was tempting, but the idea of pretending to be married to this woman, it was unsettling. He didn't know her, didn't understand her, and he certainly didn't want to be tied to her, even in a pretend marriage. But then, he thought of his ranch, of the ashes and the emptiness. He thought of the railroad men, of the injustice and the loss. And he knew that he couldn't let pride stand in his way. He needed the money. He needed a fresh start. "What's the sum?" he asked, his voice flat. Eleanor named a figure, a sum that made Caleb's head spinny. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life, enough to buy a small ranch outright, with enough left over to stock it and build a new home. He hesitated, his mind still reeling. "And you're sure there's nothing more to this than just acting the part?" Eleanor met his gaze, her eyes clear and honest. "I give you my word. I just need protection, and I'm willing to pay for it." Caleb took a deep breath, the decision weighing heavily on his shoulders. He knew he was making a deal with the devil, but he couldn't see any other way out. "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll do it." Eleanor's face lit up with relief. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you so much." Caleb nodded, his expression grim. He knew he had just made a bargain that would change his life forever. He just hoped he wouldn't regret it. The barkeep brought over the water for Shadow and pointed them towards a small, richly furnished room at the back of the saloon. As they walked towards it, Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a trap, a carefully laid snare that would tighten around him with each passing day. He looked at Eleanor, her face radiant with gratitude, and wondered what he had gotten himself into. He knew that pretending to be her husband would be a challenge, a test of his will and his patience. But he also knew that he had to do it. He had to rebuild his life, to reclaim what he had lost. And if that meant entering into a sham marriage with a beautiful stranger, then so be it. As they entered the small room, Caleb knew that their journey had just begun, and he had a feeling that it would be a long and difficult one. A journey filled with danger, deception, and perhaps, just perhaps, a flicker of hope. The small room smelled of dust and stale linen. A single narrow bed dominated the space, covered with a threadbare quilt. A rickety wooden chair sat in the corner, and a cracked mirror hung on the wall. It was a far cry from the grand hotels Eleanor was likely accustomed to, but it was Yifu shelter. Caleb set his saddlebags down near the door, his movements deliberate, avoiding eye contact with Eleanor. He felt a strange mix of emotions, a gnawing guilt for deceiving her, a simmering resentment for his own predicament, and a grudging admiration for her resilience. Eleanor stood in the center of the room, her shoulders slumped, her initial relief fading into a weary resignation. She ran a hand through her hair, dislodging a few strands of dust. "This isn't exactly the Ritz," she said, her voice laced with a hint of self-deprecating humor. Caleb grunted in response, unpacking his bedroll. "It's a roof over your head." He spread the bedroll on the floor, pointedly avoiding the bed. He wasn't about to share it with her, no matter the terms of their agreement. Eleanor watched him, her expression unreadable. "You don't trust me, do you?" she asked, her voice soft. Caleb paused, his phone sneaking on his rifle. "Trust is a luxury I can't afford." He didn't elaborate, didn't explain the years of betrayal and disappointment that had hardened his heart. He simply turned away, busying himself with cleaning his rifle, the metallic clicks and scrapes filling the silence. Eleanor sighed, accepting his unspoken answer. She understood. She too had learned the hard way that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken. "So," she said, breaking the silence, "how do we do this?" Caleb looked up, his brow furrowed. "Do what?" "Convince them we're married," she explained. "We can't just stay holed up in this room. People will start to talk." He considered her point. She was right. They needed to put on a show, to create a believable illusion of marital bliss. The thought made his stomach churn. "What do you suggest?" he asked, his voice grudging. Eleanor hesitated, then spoke, her cheeks flushing slightly. "We need to act like a couple, hold hands maybe, exchange a few affectionate words." Caleb stared at her, aghast. "You're asking me to hold your hand?" Eleanor bit her lip, her eyes pleading. It's just for show, she said, just to make it believable. Caleb groaned inwardly. He hadn't bargained for this. He could face down outlaws, ride through blizzards, and survive in the wilderness. But the thought of pretending to be affectionate with a woman he barely knew filled him with dread. Fine, he said, his voice tight. But no kissing. Eleanor's eyes widened. I wasn't planning on it, she said, her voice indignant. Just making sure, Caleb muttered, turning back to his rifle. They spent the next hour discussing their cover story, crafting a plausible narrative for their supposed marriage. They decided they had met in St. Louis, fallen in love, and decided to seek their fortune in the West. They agreed on details of their fabricated courtship, their non-existent wedding, and their entirely fictional plans for the future. The exercise felt absurd, a charade built on lies and half-truths. But Caleb knew that it was necessary. Their survival depended on it. As dusk settled over the town, they emerged from their room, ready to face the scrutiny of the saloon patrons. Caleb felt a knot of tension in his stomach, his senses on high alert. They walked into the saloon, Caleb placing a hand on Eleanor's back, guiding her through the crowd. He felt her stiffen beneath his touch, but she didn't pull away. The saloon fell silent as they entered, all eyes turning towards them. Caleb could feel the weight of their gaze, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. He forced himself to smile, a strained, unnatural expression that felt foreign on his face. Evening, folks, he said, his voice rough. This is my wife, Eleanor. Eleanor smiled, a more genuine expression that radiated warmth and charm. Good evening, she said, her voice clear and confident. They walked to the bar, Caleb ordering 2 whiskeys. As the barkeep poured their drinks, Caleb leaned towards Eleanor, lowering his voice. Remember the story, he whispered. St. Louis. Courtship. Wedding. Eleanor nodded, her eyes sparkling. Don't worry, she said, her voice teasing. I'm a natural actress. They raised their glasses, toasting to their fake marriage. As they drank, Caleb kept a watchful eye on the saloon patrons, gauging their reactions. The burly man who had harassed Eleanor earlier was watching them with narrowed eyes, a sneer on his face. Caleb met his gaze, his expression challenging. The man looked away, muttering something under his breath. A few other patrons offered polite nods and greetings, their curiosity seemingly satisfied. Caleb felt a slight sense of relief. It seemed their charade was working, at least for now. They spent the evening in the saloon, mingling with the townsfolk, answering their questions about their past and their future. Eleanor charmed everyone with her wit and her grace, while Caleb played the role of the stoic, protective husband. He found himself surprisingly enjoying the performance. It was a welcome distraction from his grief and his anger, a chance to escape, however briefly, from the weight of his past. As the night wore on, the tension between Caleb and Eleanor eased slightly. They found a rhythm in their charade, a comfortable distance that allowed them to interact without awkwardness. They even managed to share a few genuine smiles, a flicker of connection that transcended their pretense. As they walked back to their room, Eleanor turned to Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said. You were amazing. Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. Just playing the part, he said. They entered the small room, the ceilings heavy in the air. Caleb unrolled his bedroll on the floor, avoiding eye contact with Eleanor. She sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped. This is going to be difficult, isn't it? She said, her voice soft. Caleb looked at her, his expression unreadable. It doesn't have to be, he said. Just stick to the story and keep your distance. Eleanor nodded, accepting his unspoken warning. She knew that their arrangement was fraught with danger, both physical and emotional, but she was determined to see it through. She had to find her brother. She blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness. Caleb lay on his bedroll, listening to her soft breathing, the silence broken only by the creaking of the saloon and the distant howl of a coyote. He couldn't sleep. His mind was racing, filled with thoughts of Eleanor, of the railroad men, of his lost ranch. He wondered if he had made the right decision, entering into this sham marriage. He wondered if he would ever find peace. He goes in his sighs, trying to block out the noise and the thoughts. He knew that the days ahead would be long and hard, but he was a survivor. He would find a way to move and Detroit. He had to. He drifted off to sleep, his hand resting on his rifle, his senses on high alert. He knew that danger lurked around every corner, and he was ready to face it, for Eleanor and for himself. The following morning dawned harsh and bright, painting the dusty town in shades of orange and salt. Caleb rose before first light, his body stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. He dressed quickly, pulling on his worn boots and checking his Colt Peacemaker. He moved with a practiced economy of motion, a testament to years spent living close to the land. He stepped outside, the air crisp and cool against his skin. Shadow was already saddled, patiently waiting near the watering trough. Caleb nodded to the barkeep, who was sweeping the porch, and began tightening the cinch on Shadow's saddle. Eleanor emerged from the saloon a few minutes later, dressed in a more practical riding outfit than the silk dress she'd worn the day before. She looked less like a city lady and more like someone prepared for a long journey, though the fine leather still screamed of money. Caleb had to admit, she cleaned up well. She carried a small valise and a rifle he hadn't seen before. "Ready?" he asked, his voice gruff. Eleanor nodded, her expression determined. "As I'll ever be." They mounted their horses, Caleb taking the lead. He urged Shadow forward, heading west along the dusty track. The town quickly receded behind them, swallowed by the vastness of the plains. The landscape was unforgiving, a seemingly endless expanse of scrub brush, rocky hills, and parched earth. The sun beat down relentlessly, turning the air into a shimmering haze. The silence was broken only by the key of their saddles, the thud of their horses' hooves, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As they rode, Caleb couldn't help but be reminded of his own journey west years ago, when he had come to this land full of hope and ambition. He had built a life for himself, a ranch, home. Now all that was gone, reduced to ashes by the greed of others. He glanced at Eleanor, riding beside him, her face pale but resolute. She was a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he was fighting to reclaim. "How far is this town you're headed to?" Caleb asked, breaking the silence. "It's called Redemption," Eleanor replied. "It's about 3 days' ride from here. My mother's sister lives there. She might know something about Thomas." 3 days. 3 days of riding through this desolate country, pretending to be married to a woman he barely knew. Caleb sighed inwardly. As the day wore on, the sun grew hotter, the landscape more monotonous. Eleanor, despite her initial enthusiasm, began to show signs of fatigue. Her shoulders slumped. Her riding grew less steady. Caleb, noticing her discomfort, reined in Shadow. "We'll stop here for a while," he said, pointing to a small cluster of rocks that offered a sliver of shade. They dismounted, Caleb watering the horses from his canteen. He then helped Eleanor dismount, noticing how unsteady she was on her feet. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. Eleanor nodded, but her face was pale and drawn. "I'm just not used to riding for so long." Caleb knew that she needed more than just rest. She needed to learn how to survive in this harsh environment. He pulled out his knife and began gathering dry wood. "I'll teach you how to build a fire," he said. "It's a skill you'll need to know out here." Eleanor watched him, her eyes curious. I don't know anything about surviving in the wilderness, she admitted. I've always lived in cities. Caleb chuckled, a short, harsh sound. Well, you're not in a city anymore. Out here, you have to rely on yourself. He showed her how to gather kindling, how to build a teepee-shaped structure, how to strike a flint and steel to create a spark. Eleanor watched him intently, her initial hesitation giving way to a growing sense of confidence. After a few tries, she managed to start a small fire, the flames flickering merrily in the sunlight. Caleb nodded approvingly. Not bad, he said. Now I'll show you how to find water. He led her to a nearby patch of dry earth, pointing to a few withered plants. These plants often grow near underground springs, he explained. If you dig deep enough, you might find water. Eleanor looked skeptical, but she followed his instructions, digging into the dry earth with a small shovel. After a few minutes, she struck something damp. I think I found something, she exclaimed, her voice filled with excitement. Caleb helped her dig, and soon they had uncovered a small pool of water, enough to fill their canteens. Eleanor looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said. I never would have been able to do this without you. Caleb shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. Just teaching you the basics, he said. There's a lot more to learn. As they rested, Caleb began to notice a change in Eleanor. She was still refined and elegant, but there was a new toughness in her eyes, a resilience that had been forged by the harshness of the landscape. He realized that she was more than just a delicate city flower. She was a survivor, just like him. That evening, as they camped under the stars, Caleb taught Eleanor how to shoot her rifle. He showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. Eleanor was a quick learner, her shots becoming more accurate with each passing try. Caleb was impressed by her focus and her determination. You're a natural, he said, his voice tinged with admiration. Eleanor smiled, her eyes sparkling in the firelight. Thank you, she said. I feel powerful. As they sat around the campfire, sharing a meager meal of dried meat and hardtack, Caleb and Eleanor began to talk, sharing stories about their lives. Caleb told her about his ranch, about his family, about the fire that had destroyed everything. Eleanor listened intently, her eyes filled with sympathy. She told him about her brother, about his dreams of building a better life in the West, about her fears for his safety. As they talked, Caleb began to feel a connection with Eleanor, a bond that transcended their fake marriage. He realized that they were both searching for something, both trying to heal from the wounds of the past. The next few days passed in a similar fashion, with Caleb teaching Eleanor survival skills and Eleanor sharing stories about her life. They grew closer with each passing day, their initial distrust giving way to a grudging respect and perhaps something more. One evening, as they camped near a small creek, Caleb noticed a group of riders approaching in the distance. He tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his rifle. Trouble, he said, his voice low. Get behind me. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She grabbed her rifle and took cover behind Caleb, her eyes scanning the horizon. The riders drew closer, their faces grim and determined. Caleb recognized them immediately. They were the same burly man and his companions who had harassed Eleanor in the saloon. Well, the burly man said, his voice dripping with menace. Look what we have here. The happy couple. Caleb stepped forward, his eyes narrowed. What do you want? He asked, his voice dangerous. We just want to have a little chat with your wife, the burly man said, his eyes leering at Eleanor. We didn't get a chance to properly introduce ourselves back in town. Caleb's hand tightened around his rifle. Leave her alone, he said, or you'll regret it. The burly monk chuckled. You and what army? Before Caleb could respond, stepped forward, her rifle raised. I suggest you leave now, she said, her voice clear and steady. unless you want to find out what a city lady can do with a gun." The burly man looked surprised, but he quickly recovered. "You wouldn't dare," he said. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing through the canyon. The burly man flinched, his eyes widening in fear. He looked at Caleb, then back at Eleanor, his bravado fading. "All right," he said, his voice subdued. "We'll leave, but we'll be back." He and his companions turned their horses and rode away, disappearing into the darkness. Caleb lowered his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Eleanor, her face pale but determined. "You all right?" he asked, his voice tinged with admiration. Eleanor nodded, her eyes sparkling. "I'm fine," she said. "But next time I won't aim for the sky." Caleb smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. He knew that Eleanor was a force to be reckoned with, and he was glad to have her on his side. The encounters with the outlaws served as a stark reminder of the dangers lurking on the trail. Caleb doubled his vigilance, scanning the horizon constantly, his senses sharpened by the near brush with death. Eleanor too seemed changed, her gaze more focused, her movements more deliberate. The shared threat had forged a silent understanding between them, a bond tempered in the fires of fear. 2 days later, as they wound their way through a narrow canyon, the land seemed to hold its breath. The air hung heavy and still, the silence broken only by the rhythmic clop of hooves on the rocky ground. Caleb felt a prickling unease, a premonition of something ill. He reined in shadow, holding up a hand to stop Eleanor. "Something's not right," he muttered, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. Before Eleanor could respond, a volley of gunfire erupted from above. Bullets whizzed past their heads, kicking up dust and snow. Caleb reacted instantly, pulling Eleanor from her horse and shoving her behind a large boulder. "Ambush!" he yelled, drawing his Colt Peacemaker. The canyon was alive with the sound of gunfire, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Outlaws perched on the canyon rims rained down bullets on the trapped travelers. Caleb returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, picking off the attackers one by one. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his years, his body a well-oiled machine honed by years of survival in the West. He dove, rolled, and fired, using every rock and crevice for cover. He felt a grim satisfaction as he saw several outlaws fall, their bodies tumbling down the canyon walls. The skills he thought he'd lost, dulled by grief and inaction, were now razor-sharp, honed by the desperate need to protect Eleanor. Eleanor, surprisingly, didn't cower in fear. She kept her head down, reloading Caleb's rifle and handing it to him whenever he needed it. She moved with a surprising calm, her city-bred elegance replaced by a gritty determination. "More ammunition!" Caleb barked, his voice strained. Eleanor scrambled through their saddlebags, pulling out boxes of cartridges. She ripped them open, handing them to Caleb with steady hands. Her bravery surprised him, a hidden strength he hadn't suspected. The firefight raged on, the canyon echoing with the roar of gunfire. Caleb knew they couldn't hold out forever. They were outnumbered and outgunned, trapped in a deadly crossfire. He spotted their leader, a man with a cruel face and a black bandana covering his nose and mouth. He was perched on a high rock, directing the attack. Caleb knew that if he could take out the leader, the outlaws might lose their nerve. Taking a deep breath, Caleb moved with lightning speed, dodging bullets and scrambling up the canyon wall. He reached a small ledge, giving him a clear shot at the leader. He aimed his Colt Peacemaker, taking careful aim. He squeezed the trigger, the gun bucking in his hand. The bullet found its mark, striking the leader in the chest. He gasped, clutching his chest, and tumbled from the rock, his body crashing to the canyon floor below. With their leader gone, the outlaws began to falter. Their gunfire became less accurate, their attacks less coordinated. Caleb pressed his advantage, firing relentlessly, driving the remaining outlaws back. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the gunfire ceased. The canyon fell silent, save for the echo of the last shots and the soft moaning of the wounded. Caleb cautiously emerged from behind his cover, his body aching, his ears ringing. He scanned the canyon, making sure the outlaws were truly gone. "Eleanor," he called, his voice hoarse. "Are you all right?" Eleanor emerged from behind the boulder, her face pale but unharmed. She rushed to Caleb, her eyes filled with concern. "You're hurt," she exclaimed, noticing a gash on his arm. Caleb looked down, seeing a bloody streak running down his sleeve. He hadn't even noticed it in the heat of the battle. "It's just a scratch," he said, dismissing her concern. "Let me see," Eleanor insisted, pulling out a clean cloth and some water from her saddlebags. She gently cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle and skilled. Caleb winced as she applied pressure, but he didn't pull away. He watched her, his eyes drawn to her focused expression, her soft hands tending to his injury. As she bandaged his arm, he felt a strange warmth spreading through him. It wasn't just the pain, or the adrenaline fading from his system. It was something more, something deeper. He saw a different side of Eleanor, a side that was strong, compassionate, and fiercely independent. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft. Eleanor looked up, her eyes meeting his. "You saved my life," she said. "I don't know how to repay you." Caleb shook his head. "We saved each other," he said. They stared at each other for a long moment, the silence filled with unspoken emotions. The line between pretense and genuine connection had blurred, almost imperceptibly. They were no longer just strangers bound by a fake marriage. They were survivors bound by a shared experience, a shared danger, a shared respect. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon, they began to assess the damage. Their wagon was riddled with bullet holes, their supplies scattered. Several of their horses had been killed or wounded. "We're going to have to make camp here," Caleb said, his voice grim. "We can't travel any further tonight." They worked together, salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Eleanor, despite her exhaustion, helped Caleb tend to the wounded horses, applying bandages and offering words of comfort. As they sat around a small campfire, sharing a meager meal of what remained of their rations, the silence was broken only by the crackling of the flames. "Jed," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "That was Jed Cooley. He's meaner than a rattlesnake in a boot." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with concern. "Will he come back?" Caleb shrugged. "Maybe. Cooley doesn't like to leave things unfinished." He stared into the fire, his mind racing. He knew that they were still in danger. Cooley and his gang could return at any time. He had to find a way to protect Eleanor, to get her safely to redemption. He looked at Eleanor, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. She was strong, resilient, and surprisingly resourceful. But she was still a woman, alone in a dangerous land. And he had promised to protect her. He knew what he had to do. He had to get her out of this mess, even if it meant risking his own life. He stood up, his decision made. "We're leaving in the morning," he said, his voice firm. "We're going to find a safer route to redemption. And we're going to be ready for Jed Cooley, if he decides to come looking for us again." The embers glowed, painting their faces in flickering shades of orange and red. The vast, star-strewn sky pressed down on them, a silent witness to their shared isolation. The coyotes howled in the distance, a mournful symphony that echoed the loneliness in Caleb's skull. He'd banked the fire, rationing the wood. Every resource was precious now. Eleanor shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The desert nights were unforgiving, a stark contrast to the scorching days. She stared into the flames, her expression unreadable. Caleb knew she was still shaken by the ambush, the near-death experience etched on her face. He hadn't pushed her to talk, knowing she'd open up when she was ready. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband. He wasn't a good man." Caleb remained silent, offering her the space to continue. He knew what it was like to carry a burden of pain, a secret shame that gnawed at your insides. Eleanor took a deep breath, the air catching in her throat. He controlled everything. My money, my friends, my life. He wouldn't let me leave the house without his permission. He hit me. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken suffering. Caleb felt a surge of anger, a protective instinct he hadn't felt in years. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out, to find the man who had hurt her and make him pay. "I ran away," Eleanor continued, her voice trembling. "I couldn't take it anymore. I used what little money I had hidden away to buy a ticket west. I was hoping to find my brother, start a new life. But now—" She trailed off, her voice choked with despair. "Now I don't know what to do." Caleb reached out, placing a hand on her arm. His touch was hesitant, unsure, but it conveyed a silent message of support. "You're not alone, Eleanor," he said, his voice gruff but sincere. "I'll help you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered. "That means more than you know." The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, a silence filled with understanding and empathy. Caleb knew he couldn't fully comprehend the pain she had endured, but he could offer her his protection, his strength, his companionship. After a long moment, Caleb shifted, the firelight reflecting in his weathered eyes. "You deserve to know why I'm out here too, Eleanor." He hesitated, the memories flooding back. The images of his burning ranch seared into his mind. He hadn't spoken of it to anyone. The grief and anger too raw, too overwhelming. But something about Eleanor's vulnerability, her willingness to share her own pain, compelled him to open up. "I had a ranch," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "A good one. Built it up from nothing, me and my wife. Took years, but we made it something special." He paused, swallowing hard. "Then the railroad came. Wanted my land. Offered me a pittance. I refused." He continued, his voice hardening with each word. "They didn't take kindly to that. Started harassing me, cutting my fence, stealing my cattle. Tried to force me out. But I wouldn't budge." He clenched his jaw, his eyes burning with a cold fury. "Then one night, they came, set fire to my ranch. My wife, she didn't make it out." His voice cracked, the pain of his loss still sharp, still unbearable. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, Caleb, I'm so sorry." Caleb nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I lost everything that night. My wife, my home, my livelihood. Everything I'd worked for, gone in an instant." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Now I'm hunting the men responsible. The railroad men. I won't rest until they pay for what they did." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a desperate plea for understanding. "That's why I'm out here. That's why I'm so closed off. I can't afford to trust anyone. Not anymore." Eleanor reached out, taking his hand in hers. Her touch was warm and comforting, a lifeline in his sea of grief. "I understand, Caleb," she said, her voice soft and soothing. "You've been through hell, but you don't have to go through it alone." He looked at her, his heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and longing. He had spent so long pushing people away, walling himself off from the world, that he had forgotten what it felt like to connect with another human being. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice barely audible. "For listening, for understanding." They sat in silence for a long time. their hands clasped together, their shared vulnerabilities creating a fragile bond between them. The vastness of the wilderness seemed less daunting, the loneliness less profound. They had found solace in each other's company, a flickering flame of hope in the darkness. Later, as they lay beneath the stars, the weight of their burdens seemed a little lighter. They had shared their secrets, their fears, their hopes. They had opened themselves up to each other, risking vulnerability in a world that rewarded strength and stoicism. Caleb closed his eyes, the image of Eleanor's face etched in his mind. He still didn't trust easily. Years of betrayal wouldn't vanish overnight, but something had shifted. The wall around his heart had cracked, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate the darkness. He still had a long road ahead of him, a journey filled with danger and uncertainty. But now, he wouldn't be traveling alone. He had Eleanor by his side, a fellow survivor, a kindred spirit. And that, he realized, was more valuable than he could have ever imagined. The thought, unbidden and unexpected, brought a measure of peace to his restless soul. He drifted off to sleep, the howling coyotes sounding a little less mournful, a little more like a lullaby. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pink and gold, waking Caleb with a start. He lay for a moment, listening to the sounds of the awakening desert, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, the gentle snores of Eleanor beside him. He watched her for a long moment, her face peaceful in sleep, the events of the previous day seemingly erased by the quiet of the night. He felt a pang of guilt, knowing that he was dragging her deeper into his own world of danger and violence. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb her, and walked to the edge of their camp. He surveyed the surrounding landscape, his senses on high alert. He knew that Jed Cooley could be anywhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike. The thought of Jed's leering eyes on Eleanor sent a surge of anger through him. He would protect her, no matter the cost. He started a small fire, brewing some coffee, and heating up the last of their dried meat. As he ate, he considered their options. They couldn't stay here, exposed and vulnerable. They needed to find a safer route to redemption, one that would hopefully avoid Jed Cooley and his gang. As Eleanor stirred, stretching and yawning, Caleb offered her some coffee. She accepted it gratefully, taking a long sip. "Morning," she said, her voice still raspy with sleep. "Morning," Caleb replied, his gaze unwavering. "We need to get moving. I don't like staying in one place too long." Eleanor nodded, understanding the unspoken reason behind his urgency. She quickly packed her belongings, her movements efficient and purposeful. She was no longer the helpless city woman he had met in town. She had adapted to the harsh realities of the West, her spirit tempered by adversity. They saddled their horses and set off, heading west towards the rising sun. Caleb led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He chose a route that took them through rocky canyons and dense thickets, hoping to avoid detection. They rode for several hours without incident, the silence broken only by the sounds of their horses and the occasional cry of a hawk. Caleb began to feel a sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jed Cooley was close by, stalking them like a predator. As they rounded a bend in the trail, they came face to face with a group of riders. Caleb recognized them immediately. It was Jed Cooley and his gang, blocking their path. Caleb drew his Colt Peacemaker, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was it, the showdown he had been dreading. He glanced at Eleanor, her face pale, but resolute. She held her rifle steady, her eyes fixed on Jed Cooley. "Well, well, well," Jed said, his voice dripping with menace. "Look who we have here. I was wondering when you'd show your faces again." "What do you want, Cooley?" Caleb asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jed chuckled. "I just want to have a little chat. I have a proposition for you." He paused, his eyes scanning Eleanor. A very lucrative proposition. Caleb narrowed his eyes, sensing a trap. What kind of proposition? Jed grinned, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. I know all about your little friend here twice, he said, his eyes leering at Eleanor. I know about her past, her troubles. I know that her husband is looking for her. Eleanor gasped, her face turning white. Caleb shot her a reassuring glance, his hand tightening around his gun. And I know that there are people who are willing to pay a lot of money to get her back. Jed continued, his voice smooth and persuasive. A lot of money, Caleb. Enough to set you up for life. All you have to do is turn her over to me. Caleb stared at Jed, his mind free. He knew that Jed was telling the truth. Eleanor's persist had caught up with her. He could turn her over to Jed, collect the reward, and be done with it. He could finally have the money he needed to rebuild his life, to avenge his wife's death. But as he looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with fear and desperation, he knew that he couldn't do it. He couldn't betray her, not after everything they had been through. He had made a promise to protect her, and he intended to keep it. I'm not interested, Caleb said, his voice cold and firm. Get out of our way, Cooley. Jed's grin faded, replaced by a look of anger. You're making a mistake, Caleb, he said, his voice hardening. A big mistake. You don't know who you're dealing with. I know exactly who I'm dealing with, Caleb replied, his eyes locked on Jed's. A low-life scumbag who preys on the weak and vulnerable. Jed's face turned red with fury. You'll regret this, Caleb, he snarled. You'll regret the day you ever crossed me. Maybe, Caleb said, his voice calm and steady. But I won't regret doing the right thing. He holstered his Colt Peacemaker, a deceptive move. He needed to buy time, to lull Jed into a false sense of security. All right, Cooley, he said, his voice resigned. You win. I'll turn her over to you, but I want to see the money first. Jed's eyes lit up, his greed overriding his suspicion. That's more like it, Caleb, he said, his voice regaining its smoothness. I knew you were a reasonable man. I'm reasonable when it comes to money, Caleb replied, his voice flat. Show me the money, and I'll give you the girl. Jed nodded to one of his men, who rode forward carrying a heavy sack. He tossed it to Caleb, who caught it with one hand. He opened the sack, peering inside. It was filled with gold coins, more money than he had ever seen in his life. Satisfied? Jed asked, his eyes gleaming. Satisfied enough, Caleb replied, his hand reaching for his Colt Peacemaker. Now get ready to meet your maker, Cooley. Before Jed could react, Caleb drew his gun and fired, hitting Jed in the chest. Jed gasped, clutching his chest, and tumbled from his horse. The other outlaws reacted instantly, drawing their guns and firing at Caleb and Eleanor. Caleb grabbed Eleanor, pulling her behind a nearby boulder. The canyon erupted in gunfire, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Caleb returned fire, his shots precise and deadly, picking off the outlaws one by one. Eleanor reloaded his rifle, her movements swift and efficient. They fought side by side, their courage and determination fueled by their shared desire to survive. After a fierce firefight, the remaining outlaws scattered, fleeing into the desert. Caleb watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. He had survived another battle, but he knew that the war was far from over. Jed Cooley was dead, but there would be others who would come looking for Eleanor, drawn by the lure of money. He turned to Eleanor, her face pale but unharmed. Are you all right? He asked, his voice filled with concern. Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. I'm fine, she said. But what do we do now? They'll keep coming, won't they? Caleb looked at her, his expression grim. Yes, they will, he said. But we'll be ready for them. We'll keep fighting until we reach redemption. And then, we'll figure out what to do next. He looked down at the sack of gold lying on the ground. He picked it up, weighing it in his hand. The money was tempting, a chance to start over, to rebuild his life. But he knew that he couldn't keep it. It was tainted, stained with blood and greed. He looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with hope and trust. He knew that he had made the right decision, the only decision he could make. He would protect her, even if it meant sacrificing everything. The money meant nothing compared to the bond they had formed, the shared experiences that had forged a connection stronger than any promise or pretense. He walked to the edge of the canyon and hurled the sack of gold into the abyss, watching as it disappeared into the darkness below. "Let's go," he said, his voice resolute. "We have a long way to go." The sun beat down mercilessly as they rode, the air thick and heavy. Caleb's arm throbbed, the makeshift bandage soaked through with blood. He hadn't led on to Eleanor, but the bullet had grazed him deeper than he'd initially thought. Each jolt of the horse sent a fresh wave of pain through his body. He needed to find shelter, and soon. He led them into a narrow canyon, a winding crevice carved into the rock face. The walls rose high above, providing shade and concealment. It was a gamble, a bottleneck. But Caleb had seen something in the terrain, a potential advantage. He'd scouted this area before years ago, tracking a mountain lion. He remembered a hidden passage, a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon floor. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, his voice strained. "Good cover." Eleanor dismounted, her face etched with concern. "You're hurt," she said, her eyes fixed on his blood-stained sleeve. "Let me see." Caleb hesitated, but he knew he couldn't hide it from her any longer. He allowed her to examine the wound, wincing as she gently probed the area. "It's not good," she said, her voice grim. "We need to clean it properly, stitch it if we can." Caleb nodded, knowing she was right. They found a small shaded alcove and set about tending to his injury. Eleanor ripped strips of cloth from her petticoat, cleaning the wound with water from their dwindling supply. Caleb gritted his teeth, enduring the pain in silence. As she worked, he studied the canyon walls, his mind racing. He knew that the outlaws wouldn't give up easily. They would regroup, lick their wounds, and come after them again. He had to be ready. "There's a ledge," he said, his voice low. "Hidden passage. I remember it from years back. I can get up there. Have a good vantage point." Eleanor looked up, her eyes filled with worry. "You can't climb with that arm," she said. "It's too dangerous." "I don't have a choice," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "We need to be prepared. If they come back, I want to see them coming." He knew she was right to be concerned, but he couldn't afford to take any chances with this. He needed to protect her, even if it meant risking his own life. He slowly, painstakingly, made his way up the canyon wall, using his good arm to pull himself along. The climb was arduous, each movement sending a jolt of pain through his injured arm. He ignored it, focusing on his goal. Finally, he reached the ledge, a narrow shelf of rock overlooking the canyon floor. He scanned the surrounding area, his eyes sharp and alert. The canyon was silent, the only sound the gentle whisper of the wind. He settled in, bracing himself against the rock face. He could see for miles in every direction, a clear view of the approaching trail. He waited, his senses on high alert, his Colt peacemaker resting in his lap. Hours passed, the sun slowly sinking in the west. The shadows lengthened, casting the canyon in an eerie glow. Caleb began to wonder if he had been wrong, if the outlaws had given up. Just as he was about to give up hope, he saw them. A group of riders emerging from the distance. They were moving slowly, cautiously, their eyes scanning the canyon walls. It was Jed Cooley's remaining men, regrouped and thirsting for revenge. Caleb tensed, his hand tightening around his gun. He knew that this was it, the final showdown. He took a deep breath, focusing his mind, preparing himself for the battle ahead. He watched as the outlaws entered the canyon, their horses picking their way carefully over the rocky ground. They were spread out, their guns drawn, their faces grim. They were expecting trouble. Caleb waited until they were deep inside the canyon, directly below his position. He took aim, his hand steady, despite the pain in his arm. He fired, the shot echoing through the canyon. The bullet struck one of the outlaws, sending him tumbling from his horse. The others reacted instantly, scrambling for cover. The canyon erupted in gunfire, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Caleb fired again and again, his shots precise and deadly. He picked off the outlaws one by one, his years of experience as a gunslinger paying off. Below, Eleanor had taken cover behind a large boulder, returning fire with her rifle. She moved with a surprising speed and agility, her shots accurate and effective. She was holding her own, proving that she was more than just a helpless city woman. The gunfight raged on, the canyon echoing with the roar of gunfire. The outlaws were pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. Caleb had them trapped, just as he had planned. But they were still dangerous, their bullets whizzing past his head, kicking up dust and stone. He knew that he couldn't stay on the ledge forever. He needed to get down there, to finish them off. Taking a deep breath, he began to climb down the canyon wall, his movements slow and deliberate. The climb was even more difficult than before, his injured arm screaming in pain. He reached the canyon floor, landing softly behind a large boulder. He peeked around the edge, surveying the scene. The outlaws were scattered, taking cover behind rocks and trees. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they were still fighting. He moved quickly, dodging bullets and scrambling from one piece of cover to another. He fired his gun, taking down another outlaw. He was getting closer, closing in on the remaining members of Jed Cooley's gang. Suddenly, he heard a shout. He turned to see one of the outlaws charging towards Eleanor, his gun raised. Eleanor was caught off guard, unable to react in time. Without thinking, Caleb lunged forward, throwing himself in front of Eleanor. He felt a searing pain in his chest as a bullet ripped through his body. He stumbled, collapsing to the ground. Eleanor screamed, rushing to his side. "Caleb!" she cried, her voice filled with terror. "No!" Caleb looked up at her, his face pale and drawn. He smiled weakly, his eyes filled with a strange sense of peace. "I told you I'd protect you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I always keep my promises." He closed his eyes, his body going limp. The sound of gunfire faded away, replaced by a deafening silence. He had done his duty. He had kept his promise. He had protected Eleanor, even at the cost of his own life. Eleanor cradled his head in her lap, tears streaming down her face. She had lost her protector, her friend, the man who had shown her kindness and compassion in a cruel and unforgiving world. She didn't know what she would do without him. The remaining outlaws, seeing their opportunity, emerged from their hiding place, advancing towards Eleanor. They were eager to finish the job, to eliminate the last obstacle in their path. But as they approached, they hesitated. They saw something in Eleanor's eyes, a fierce determination, a burning rage. They saw a woman who had been pushed to the brink, a woman who had nothing left to lose. Eleanor rose to her feet, her face set in a mask of fury. She grabbed Caleb's Colt Peacemaker, her hand trembling, but firm. She leveled the gun at the outlaws, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You're not going to get away with this," she said, her voice cold and deadly. "I'm going to make you pay for what you've done." And with that, she opened fire. The canyon erupted in gunfire once more, but this time, it was Eleanor who was doing the shooting. She fought with a ferocity and skill that surprised even herself. She had learned from Caleb. She had absorbed his knowledge, his techniques, his unfurling determination. She took down the outlaws one by one, her shots precise and deadly. She moved with a speed and agility that belied her small frame, dodging bullets and scrambling for cover. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman transformed by grief and rage. Finally, the last outlaw fell, his body crashing to the ground. The canyon fell silent, save for the echo of the last shots and the soft sobs of Eleanor. She stood there, panting, her body trembling, her face streaked with tears and blood. She had done it. She had survived. But at what cost? She had lost Caleb, the man who had saved her life, the man who had given her hope. She knelt beside his body, her heart aching with grief. She closed his eyes, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. She would never forget him, his kindness, his courage, his unfreezing loyalty. He had been a true hero, a man who had given his life to protect another. She knew that she couldn't stay here, not with Caleb gone. She had to move on, to continue her journey to redemption. She would honor his memory by living her life to the fullest, by never giving up, by always fighting for what was. The silence pressed down, heavier now than any gunfire. Eleanor knelt beside Caleb, the metallic tang of blood thick in the air. The sun, sinking behind the canyon walls, cast long, distorted shadows that danced like demons mocking her grief. He was still breathing, shallow, ragged breaths that rattled in his chest. Hope, fragile as a desert flower, bloomed within her. She tore strips from her already tattered petticoat, pressing them against the wound, trying to staunch the flow of blood. His face was ashen, his features sharp with pain. She whispered his name, her voice cracking with emotion. "Caleb, stay with me, please." He didn't respond, his eyes closed, his body still. She felt for a pulse, her heart leaping with relief as she found a faint, thready beat. He was alive, but barely. She knew she couldn't stay here. The vultures, both human and avian, would be back. She needed to find a safe place, a place where she could tend to his wounds and give him a chance to recover. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she managed to drag him onto one of the horses' sausage. It was a clumsy, desperate effort, but she managed it. She tied him securely to the saddle, praying he wouldn't fall. Leading the horse, she started walking, her legs aching, her body exhausted. She followed the canyon floor, searching for any sign of shelter. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the canyon into darkness. The air grew cold, a chilling reminder of their vulnerability. Finally, she spotted it, a small cave, hidden behind a curtain of brush. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. With a final surge of adrenaline, she managed to guide the horse to the cave entrance. She carefully unloaded Caleb, laying him gently on the cave floor. She gathered firewood, building a small fire to ward off the chill and provide some light. The flickering flames danced across his face, highlighting the lines of pain etched into his skin. She worked tirelessly throughout the night, cleaning his wound, stitching it with a needle and thread she found in his saddlebag. She had no medical training, but she did what she could, relying on instinct and desperation. As the first rays of dawn crept into the cave, she collapsed beside him, exhausted but vigilant. She watched him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He was still alive, his breathing still shallow, but he was alive. Days blurred into nights. Eleanor nursed Caleb with unwearying devotion. She hunted small game, foraging for berries and roots to supplement their meager supplies. She kept the fire burning, warding off the cold and the wild animals that roamed the canyon. She spoke to him, telling him about her life, her dreams, her fears. She told him about her abusive husband, her escape west, her hopes for a new beginning. She told him about her growing feelings for him, her admiration for his courage, his strength, his unwavering sense of justice. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she spoke anyway, needing to fill the silence, needing to connect with him in some way. Slowly, miraculously, Caleb began to recover. His breathing grew stronger, his fever subsided, his eyes flickered open. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze unfocused, his expression confused. He didn't speak, but she saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You're safe," she said, her voice soft and reassuring. "You're in a cave. I've been taking care of you." He closed his eyes again, drifting back into sleep. Eleanor smiled, relief washing over her. He was going to make it. As the days passed, Caleb's recovery continued. He regained his strength, his appetite, his ability to speak. He asked about the gunfight, about the outlaws, about Eleanor's safety. She told him everything, sparing no details. He listened in silence, his expression grim. "You saved my life," he said, his voice hoarse. "I owe you everything." "You don't owe me anything," Eleanor replied, her voice soft. "We saved each other." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else, something she couldn't quite define. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice hesitant, "about what I'm going to do, about revenge." Eleanor waited, her heart pounding in her chest. "It doesn't seem so important anymore," he continued, his gaze fixed on the cave floor. "Hunting those men, it won't bring my wife back. It won't change anything." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I'm not saying I'm going to forgive them," he said, his voice hardening. "But I'm not going to let it consume me anymore. I'm not going to let it ruin my life." He looked up at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a newfound clarity. "I want to start over," he said. "I want to build a new life, and I want you to be a part of it." Eleanor's heart leaped with joy. She had dared to dream of this moment, but she never thought it would actually happen. "What about redemption?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What about your ranch?" "Redemption can wait," Caleb replied, his voice firm. "And my ranch. Maybe one day I'll rebuild it. But for now, I just want to be with you." He reached out, taking her hand in his. His touch was warm and comforting, a symbol of his love, his trust, his commitment. Eleanor squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with tears. She had found her new beginning, her new life, her new love. And it was all thanks to this man, this silent, weathered cowboy, who had saved her life and shown her the true meaning of courage, compassion, and redemption. The sun climbed higher, bathing the cave in a warm golden light. The canyon was silent, peaceful, a sanctuary from the harsh realities of the world. Caleb and Eleanor sat together, hand in hand, their hearts filled with hope, their future uncertain, but their love unwavering. They were wounded, vulnerable, but they were together, and that, they knew, was all that mattered. The embers of revenge had cooled, replaced by a slow-burning flame of something far more precious, the promise of a shared life, forged in the crucible of hardship, and tempered by a love as enduring as the desert itself. The trail to redemption stretched before them, a ribbon of dust winding through the arid landscape. Caleb, his arm still aching despite the healing, rode beside Eleanor, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. He noticed a change in her these past few days, a withdrawal, a quiet anxiety that clung to her like the desert dust. Redemption, when it finally appeared on the horizon, was less a town and more a collection of sun-baked buildings clinging precariously to the edge of nowhere. A church steeple, bleached white by the relentless sun, was the tallest structure, a stark contrast to the dusty saloons and ramshackle dwellings that huddled beneath its shadow. As they rode into town, Caleb felt a prickling unease. The townsfolk, a motley assortment of weathered faces and wary eyes, stopped what they were doing and stood, not with curiosity, but with a guarded suspicion that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. Eleanor, usually so vibrant and engaging, kept her head down, her hand resting nervously on the butt of her rifle. "Something's not right," Caleb murmured, his voice low. Eleanor didn't reply, her gaze fixed on the dusty street ahead. They rode past the general store, its windows grimy and almost opaque, past the blacksmith's shop, where a burly man with a soot-stained face glared at them from beneath a furrowed brow, past the saloon, its swinging doors momentarily parting, to reveal a glimpse of shadowy figures and hushed voices. Finally, they reached what appeared to be the town's only hotel, a 2-story building with a faded sign that read, "The Last Chance." Caleb dismounted, his senses on high alert. He helped Eleanor down, noticing the tremor in her hands. "You all right?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. She nodded, but her eyes darted nervously around the town square. I just need to get settled," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll be fine." Caleb followed her into the hotel, the lobby dimly lit and smelling of stale beer and dust. A wizened old man with a handlebar mustache sat behind the counter, his eyes narrowed as he sized them up. "Rooms?" Caleb asked, his voice clipped. The old man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Eleanor. $2 a night, he said, his voice raspy. "Cash only." Caleb paid him, taking the key to a room on the second floor. As they climbed the stairs, he noticed Eleanor's hesitation, her reluctance to meet his gaze. "Eleanor, what's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "You're acting strange. What aren't you telling me?" She stopped on the landing, her face pale and drawn. I need to tell you something," she said, her voice trembling. "Something about redemption." He waited, his heart pounding in his chest. "This isn't the redemption I was looking for," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "The town I was supposed to come to, it was further west. I got the name wrong. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want you to be disappointed." Caleb stared at her, stunned. "You mean we came all this way for nothing?" She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she said, her voice breaking. "I messed everything up." He reached out, cupping her face in his hands. "Hey," he said, his voice soft. "It's all right. It's just a town. We'll figure it out." But he knew deep down that it was more than just a wrong turn. It was the feeling of being watched, the suspicion in the eyes of the townsfolk, the sense that they were unwelcome, unwanted. They entered their room, a small, sparsely furnished space, with a single window overlooking the town square. Caleb closed the door, locking it securely. "We're not staying here," he said, his voice firm. "Not tonight. I don't trust this place." Eleanor nodded, her relief evident. "I agree," she said. "Let's just rest for a bit. Then we'll leave under cover of darkness." They sat on the edge of the bed, the ceilings between them heavy with apprehension. Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. He needed to find out what was going on, why the townsfolk were so hostile. He rose to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for his cult peacemaker. "I'm going to take a look around," he said. "Stay here. Keep the door locked." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with worry. "Be careful," she said. "Please." Caleb left the room, his senses on high alert. He walked down the stairs, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. He passed the old man behind the counter, who watched him with narrowed eyes. "Going somewhere?" the old man asked, his voice raspy. "Just stretching my legs," Caleb replied, his voice casual. He walked out of the hotel, stepping into the dusty street. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town square. The townsfolk were still there, watching him, their eyes filled with suspicion. He walked towards the saloon, the sound of music and laughter drifting from within. He pushed open the swinging doors, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The saloon was crowded, filled with cowboys, miners, and other rough-looking characters. He walked to the bar, ordering a whiskey from the bartender. A tall, gaunt man with a handlebar mustache and a cold, calculating gaze. "You new in town?" the bartender asked, his voice flat. "Just passing through," Caleb replied, his voice casual. The bartender nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Heard you came in with the woman," he said. "Pretty woman." Caleb tensed, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. "What's it to you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The bartender chuckled, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Just curious," he said. "Some folks around here don't take kindly to strangers, especially strangers with secrets." Caleb stared at him, his mind racing. "What secrets are you talking about?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. The bartender leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Let's just say that woman you're with. She's not who she says she is. She's got a past, a dark past. And some folks around here, they know all about it." Caleb's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that Eleanor was running from something, but he didn't know the full extent of her past. He needed to find out what the bartender knew, what the townspeople knew. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The bartender grinned, revealing a set of yellowed teeth. "I'm saying you should be careful who you trust," he said. "In redemption, secrets have a way of coming out. And when they do, things can get ugly." He turned and walked away, leaving Caleb standing at the bar, his mind reeling. He knew that they were in danger, that Eleanor's past had caught up with them. He needed to protect her, but he didn't know who to trust, who to turn to. He finished his whiskey, his gaze sweeping across the saloon. He saw the faces of the townsfolk, their eyes filled with suspicion and hostility. He knew that he couldn't stay here, not for another minute. He needed to get Eleanor out of redemption before it was too late. The town's name felt like a cruel joke, a bitter reminder of hopes dashed and dangers unceasing. He turned and walked out of the saloon, stepping back into the dusty street. The sun had set, plunging the town into darkness. The shadows seemed to lengthen, to twist and writhe like the secrets that festered beneath the surface of redemption. He walked back to the hotel, his hand resting on his Colt peacemaker, his heart filled with a growing sense of dread. They were in a sun built on secrets, and those secrets were about to swallow them whole. He reached the hotel room, his knuckles rapping sharply on the door. Eleanor opened it, her face etched with worry. "What is it? What did you find out?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb hesitated, his gaze searching her eyes. He didn't know how to tell her what he had learned, how to confront her with the bartender's accusations. "We need to leave," he said, his voice flat. "Now. It's not safe here." Eleanor nodded, her face paling. "I know," she said. "I can feel it too." They gathered their belongings, packing quickly and silently. Caleb checked his Colt peacemaker, ensuring it was loaded and ready. He didn't know what they were facing, but he was prepared to fight. As they were about to leave, Eleanor stopped, her hand trembling as she reached into her satchel. She pulled out a small ornate box, its surface inlaid with mother of pearl. "I need to show you something," she said, her voice barely audible. Caleb watched her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a feeling he wasn't going to like what she was about to reveal. Eleanor opened the box, revealing a stack of documents, neatly folded and tied with a silk ribbon. She untied the ribbon, handing one of the documents to Caleb. He took it, his eyes scanning the legal jargon. It was a deed to the town of Redemption, granting ownership to one Eleanor Ainsworth. He looked up at her, his face a mask of disbelief. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tight with anger. "It's the truth," she said, her voice breaking. I own redemption. My father owned it before me. Caleb stared at her, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Everything he thought he knew about her, about their journey, was a lie. You own this town? He repeated, his voice incredulous. Then why? Why were you running? Why did you need my help? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. It's complicated, she said. Please, just let me explain. Caleb stepped back, his body rigid with anger and betrayal. Explain what? Explain how you lied to me. Explain how you used me. No, Caleb, it's not like that, she pleaded, reaching out to him. I swear. He flinched away from her touch, his gaze hardening. Then tell me the truth, Eleanor. Tell me everything. She hesitated, her face a battleground of conflicting emotions. Finally, she took a deep breath and began to speak. My father was a gambler, a drunkard, she said, her voice trembling. He lost everything, including his life, to a group of ruthless men. He left me with nothing but this town, a town that was already drowning in debt. She paused, her eyes filling with tears. I tried to make it work. I tried to save redemption, but it was no use. The town was dying. The people were suffering. I didn't know what to do. Then I met him, she continued, her voice bitter. My husband. He was wealthy, powerful. He offered to help me, to invest in redemption, to save it from ruin. But he wanted something in return. She closed her eyes, her face contorted with pain. He wanted me. He wanted to control me. He wanted to own me, just like he owned everything else. Caleb watched her, his anger slowly giving way to a grudging understanding. He could see the pain in her eyes, the desperation that had driven her to make such a terrible choice. I married him, she said, her voice barely audible. I sold myself to him, for the sake of redemption. But it was a mistake. He was cruel, abusive. He treated me like property, like a possession. She paused, taking a shaky breath. I knew I had to get away from him, but I couldn't just leave redemption to rot. So I came up with a plan. Caleb's blood ran cold. He knew what was coming. I hired Jed Cooley, she said, her voice flat. I paid him to stage an attack, to make it look like I was in danger. I wanted my husband to come after me, to try to rescue me. And then Jed was supposed to kill him. Caleb stared at her, his mind numb with shock. You hired Jed Cooley to kill your husband? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her face pale and drawn. It was the only way, she said. It was the only way to get rid of him, to free myself, to save redemption. And what about me? Caleb asked, his voice rising with anger. Where did I fit into your plan? Was I just a convenient pawn, someone to take the fall if things went wrong? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. No, Caleb, it wasn't like that, she pleaded. I didn't know you were going to get involved. I didn't plan for you to get hurt. But you didn't stop it, did you? Caleb shot back, his voice filled with bitterness. You let me risk my life for you, for your town, for your twisted plan. She reached out to him, her hand trembling. Please, Caleb, believe me, she said. I never wanted to hurt you. I care about you. Caleb stared at her, his heart aching with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a lingering sense of something else. He had come to care for her, to trust her, to believe in her. And now, he had discovered that everything he thought he knew about her was a lie. He turned away from her, his gaze fixed on the window. The town of redemption lay before him, a symbol of her deception, her manipulation. He felt used, betrayed, like he had been nothing more than a tool in her elaborate scheme. I need to think, he said, his voice flat. I need to figure out what to do. He walked out of the room, leaving Eleanor standing there alone and heartbroken. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her, if he could ever trust her again. He needed time to process everything she had revealed, time to decide what his next move would be. He walked out into the night, the secrets of redemption swirling around him like a desert storm, threatening to bury him alive. Caleb found himself outside the saloon. The same whiskey-soaked air that moments ago had felt merely unpleasant, now thick with the taste of betrayal. The faces staring back at him from within were no longer simply wary, but accusatory, knowing. He was caught in Eleanor's web, tangled in the threads of her desperate choices. He could walk away. He should walk away. Let her face the music. Let redemption rot. He owed her nothing. Except he saw the memory of her tending his wounds in that cave, her unwavering dedication. The stories she'd whispered in the park, stories of a life he now knew were only half-truths, yet still resonated with a raw, undeniable pain. He saw the flicker of genuine affection in her eyes, a vulnerability that felt different from the carefully constructed facade she'd presented. He walked, not away, but towards the edge of town, towards the stables. He needed to clear his head, to feel the familiar weight of a saddle under him, the rhythm of a horse's gait. He saddled his Mustang, the animal's warm breath a comfort in the cool night air. He rode out past the last flickering lights of redemption, into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the desert. He rode for hours, letting the horse choose the path, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Anger warred with a reluctant sympathy, betrayal with a nagging sense of responsibility. He kept replaying her confession, searching for the lie within the lie, the truth buried beneath layers of deception. The sky began to lighten, painting the horizon with streaks of pink and orange. He pulled his horse to a stop on a rise, overlooking the desolate landscape. In the distance, he could see redemption, a cluster of buildings clinging to the earth, a symbol of broken dreams and shattered trust. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't abandon her. Not entirely. He wouldn't be a part of her scheme, wouldn't condone her actions. But he couldn't simply walk away and leave her to face the consequences alone. He had a sense of justice, a code he couldn't ignore, even when the person who needed help was the one who had deceived him. He turned his horse and rode back towards redemption, the racing sun casting long shadows before him. He found Eleanor in the hotel room, sitting on the edge of the bed, her face buried in her hands. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I messed up. I understand if you want to leave." Caleb remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on her. He saw the genuine remorse in her eyes, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. "I'm not leaving," he said, his voice flat. "But things are going to be different." Eleanor looked up, her eyes widening with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I'm going to help you save this town," Caleb said, "but not with lies and deceit. We're going to do it the right way, even if it means facing the consequences of your actions." Eleanor stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and hope. "You would do that for me? After everything I've done?" Caleb nodded slowly. "I'm not doing it for you," he said. "I'm doing it for the people of redemption. They deserve a chance." He paused, his gaze hardening. "But you need to be honest with me, Eleanor. No more lies, no more secrets. Tell me everything you know about your husband, about Jed Cooley, about the people who are trying to take this town from you." Eleanor nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I will," she said. "I promise." They spent the next few hours talking, Eleanor revealing the full extent of her husband's dealings, his plans to exploit the town's resources, his connections to powerful men who would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. She told him about Jed Cooley, a ruthless gunslinger who had turned against her, now working for her husband. As she spoke, Caleb began to understand the depth of her desperation, the impossible choices she had been forced to make. He didn't forgive her, not yet. But he began to see her not as a manipulator, but as a victim, trapped in a web of circumstances beyond her control. "What about the townsfolk?" Caleb asked. "Do they know about your plan?" Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said. "I kept it a secret from everyone. I didn't want to involve them." "Then we need to tell them the truth," Caleb said. "They deserve to know what's going on." Eleanor hesitated, her face filled with fear. "I don't know if I can," she said. "They'll hate me. They'll never forgive me." "They might," Caleb said, "but they'll respect you for being honest, and they'll be more likely to help us if they know the truth." He stood up, his gaze firm. "We're going to call a town meeting," he said. "Tonight. We're going to tell them everything." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Okay," she said, "I'll do it." As word spread through Redemption, the townsfolk gathered in the church, their faces a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Caleb stood beside Eleanor, his presence a silent reassurance. He felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice trembling as she began to speak. She told them everything. From her father's gambling debts, to her marriage to the abusive husband, to her desperate plan to hire Jed Cooley. She spared no details, revealing the full extent of her deception. As she spoke, the silence in the church was palpable. Some of the townsfolk looked shocked, others angry, others simply sad. Caleb watched their faces, gauging their reactions, preparing for the backlash. When Eleanor finished, the silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of her ragged breathing. Then, slowly, a murmur began to ripple through the crowd. Some of the townsfolk began to whisper, others to argue. Finally, a voice rose above the din. It was Martha, the owner of the general store, a woman known for her strong will and unwearying sense of justice. "She made mistakes," Martha said, her voice firm. "Terrible mistakes. But she did it for us. She did it to save Redemption." Other voices joined in, some defending Eleanor, others condemning her. The debate raged for hours, the townsfolk airing their grievance, their fears and their hopes. Finally, as the night wore on, a consensus began to emerge. They wouldn't condone Eleanor's actions, but they understood her desperation. They wouldn't forgive her completely, but they were willing to give her a chance to make amends. "We'll help you, Eleanor," Martha said, her voice resolute. "We'll help you save Redemption. But you need to be honest with us every step of the way. And you need to be willing to face the consequences of your actions." Eleanor looked at the townsfolk, her eyes filled with tears. "I will," she said. "I promise. I'll do whatever it takes." As the meeting adjourned, Caleb felt a sense of cautious optimism. They had a long way to go, a difficult road ahead. But they had taken the first step towards redemption, both for Eleanor and for the town. He looked at Eleanor, her face etched with exhaustion, but also with a newfound hope. "It's not over," he said, his voice soft. "But we're in this together." Eleanor nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Caleb," she said, "for believing in me, even when I didn't believe in myself." He didn't reply, but he knew that he was starting to believe in her again. Not the Eleanor he thought he knew, but the Eleanor he was beginning to see, a flawed, damaged woman who was willing to fight for what she believed in, even if it meant facing her own demons. The fight for redemption had just begun, and it was going to be a long and bloody one. But Caleb was ready. He was ready to stand by Eleanor's side, to face whatever challenges lay ahead, and to help her find her own path to redemption, even if it meant facing the darkness within himself. The fragile truce forged in the church held, But the air in Redemption remained thick with tension. Eleanor, emboldened by the town's hesitant support and Caleb's unwavering presence, started to organize. The first order of business, fortifying the town. Caleb, drawing on his years on the trail, assessed their vulnerabilities. The main road in was easily defended, but the back routes through the canyons offered less resistance. He organized the men, even some of the older boys eager to prove themselves, into patrols. He showed them how to set up rudimentary defenses, how to use the terrain to their advantage. He didn't sugarcoat the danger, but he instilled a sense of purpose, a reason to fight beyond mere survival. Eleanor, meanwhile, worked to secure supplies. Martha emptied her general store of usable goods, while other women in town gathered what provisions they could spare. The blacksmith, initially hostile, now hammered out makeshift weapons, his face grim but determined. Caleb saw a change in Eleanor. The fear that had haunted her eyes had been replaced by a steely resolve. She was no longer the frightened woman running from her past. She was the owner of redemption, standing her ground, ready to defend what was hers. And he, somewhat reluctantly, was standing with her. Days bled into nights. The patrols reported sightings of men on horseback, shadowy figures lurking in the hills. The tension mounted, a coiled spring ready to snap. Caleb knew it was only a matter of time before Eleanor's husband, or more likely his hired guns, made their move. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, a rider approached Redemption. He rode a black stallion, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He stopped at the edge of town, his voice echoing in the gathering dusk. "Eleanor Ainsworth," he called out, "I have a message for you." Caleb stepped forward, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt Peacemaker. "She's here," he said, his voice flat. "What's your message?" The rider dismounted, revealing a face hardened by years of violence. It was Jed Cooley, his eyes cold and calculating. "Your husband sends his regards," Cooley said, his voice dripping with menace. "He wants his property back." Eleanor stepped out from behind Caleb, her face pale but resolute. "Redemption is not his property," she said, her voice clear and strong. "It's mine, and I'm not giving it up." Cooley chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You always were a stubborn one, Eleanor. Your husband is a patient man, but even his patience has its limits. He's given you a chance to surrender peacefully. If you refuse, there will be consequences." "We're not surrendering," Caleb said, his voice unwavering. "Tell your boss that redemption will be defended." Cooley's gaze shifted to Caleb, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You," he sneered, "the do-gooder. You should have stayed out of this. Now you're going to regret it." He turned and remounted his horse, his voice echoing as he rode away. "You've made your choice," he called back. "Prepare yourselves." The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn. The town was roused from its sleep by the sound of gunfire, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Cooley and his men, a dozen strong, rode into Redemption, guns blazing. Caleb, anticipating the attack, had positioned the townsfolk strategically. They returned fire from behind windows and makeshift barricades, their courage fueled by desperation and a shared sense of purpose. The battle raged, a chaotic dance of bullets and screams. Caleb moved through the town, a whirlwind of fury and precision. He took down Cooley's men one by one, his Colt Peacemaker spitting fire. He saw Martha firing a shotgun from the window of her store, her face grim but determined. He saw Eleanor, tending to the wounded, her hands stained with blood. Cooley, realizing his initial assault had failed, regrouped his men. They focused their fire on the church, the tallest building in town, hoping to drive the defenders out. Caleb knew they had to stop him. He charged towards the church, bullets whizzing past his head. He reached the building, kicking in the door and taking cover behind a pew. He saw Cooley and his men huddled behind the altar, preparing to breach the defenses. He took aim, his finger tightening on the trigger. He fired, hitting one of Cooley's men square in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering on the wooden floor. Cooley turned, his eyes blazing with rage. He raised his gun, aiming at Caleb. Before Cooley could fire, Eleanor appeared, a rifle in her hands. She fired, hitting Cooley in the shoulder. He staggered back, dropping his gun. Caleb seized the opportunity. He charged towards Cooley, tackling him to the ground. They wrestled, a brutal struggle for survival. Caleb landed a blow, blood splattering on the floor. He disarmed Cooley. The gunslinger's eyes filled with hate. "It's over, Cooley," Caleb said, his voice grim. Cooley spat at him. "It's never over," he snarled. "Your husband will be back. He'll burn this town to the ground." Caleb raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. He hesitated, his gaze locking with Cooley's. He saw the emptiness in his eyes, the years of violence that had eroded his humanity. He lowered his gun, his hand shaking. "Get out of redemption," he said, his voice flat. "And don't ever come back." Cooley, surprised by Caleb's mercy, scrambled to his feet and fled, his remaining men following close behind. As the dust settled, the townspeople emerged from their hiding place, their faces etched with relief and exhaustion. They had survived. They had defended redemption. Eleanor ran to Caleb, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You saved us," she said, her voice trembling. "You saved redemption." Caleb looked around at the townspeople, their faces bruised and bloodied but filled with a newfound sense of pride. He had come to redemption seeking redemption, but he had found something more. He had found a purpose, a reason to fight, a community to protect. "We saved redemption," he said, his voice soft. "Together." The victory was hard won, and the threat of Eleanor's husband still lingered. But redemption had found its resolve, a spirit forged in the crucible of violence and betrayal. The town stood, scarred but unbowed, ready to face whatever the future held. And Caleb, the silent cowboy who had sought only solace, found himself standing alongside them, no longer a stranger, but a protector, a part of their shared destiny. He realized that redemption wasn't just about escaping a past, but building a future, brick by painful brick, alongside those who needed him most. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of activity. The wounded were tended to, the dead mourned. Makeshift repairs began on shattered windows and bullet-riddled walls. The raw scent of survival hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of what they had endured. Eleanor, no longer hesitant, moved with a newfound authority. She directed the cleanup efforts, organized the distribution of supplies, and listened patiently to the concerns of the townsfolk. She spoke with honesty, and compassion, acknowledging her past mistakes while outlining her vision for the future. The people, seeing her genuine commitment, responded with a renewed faith. They weren't blind to her past, but they recognized her present, a leader forged in the fires of adversity. Caleb watched her, a quiet observer. He saw the transformation, the blossoming of a strength he suspected had always been there, buried beneath layers of fear and manipulation. He saw the way the townspeople looked at her, not with suspicion, but with respect, even admiration. Days turned into weeks. The physical scars of the attack slowly faded, replaced by a sense of resilience. The patrols continued, the town vigilant, but the fear that had gripped redemption began to dissipate. Life, tentatively, returned to normal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the town, Caleb found Eleanor sitting on the porch of the hotel, gazing out at the landscape. He sat beside her, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. Thank you, she said, her voice soft, for everything. Caleb shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. You did most of it yourself, he said. No, she said, I wouldn't have been able to do it without you. You gave me the strength to face my past, to stand up for what I believe in. He turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the genuine gratitude. I just did what I thought was right, he said. But you didn't have to, she said. You would have walked away. You could have left me to face the consequences alone. He remained silent for a moment, considering her words. He had indeed considered leaving. He had wrestled with the anger, the betrayal, the feeling of being used. But something had kept him here, something he couldn't quite explain. I couldn't, he said finally. I saw something in you, Eleanor, something worth fighting for. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and comforting. What happens now? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Caleb looked out at the town, at the flickering lights in the windows, at the people going about their lives. He saw the potential, the resilience, the spirit of redemption. We rebuild, he said. We make this town something worth fighting for. He turned back to Eleanor, his gaze locking with hers. He saw the same hope, the same determination. He knew that their journey was far from over, that the threat of her husband still loomed large. But he also knew that they were not alone, that they had a community to support them, a community they had helped to create. Weeks turned into months. Eleanor, with Caleb by her side, implemented new policies designed to protect the town from exploitation and ensure a fair future for all. She established a town council, giving the people a voice in their own governance. She worked to diversify the town's economy, attracting new businesses and creating new opportunities. Caleb, though not seeking a formal position, became a trusted advisor. His wisdom and experience valued by the townspeople. He helped to train the patrols, ensuring their readiness for any future threats. He also worked with the younger generation, teaching them the skills they would need to survive and thrive in the harsh landscape. He noticed a change in himself too. The bitterness that had haunted him for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. He found himself laughing again, connecting with people, forging friendships. He realized that he had been searching for redemption in all the wrong places. He had thought that revenge would fill the void in his soul, but it would have only left him emptier. He found that helping others, protecting the innocent, and finding love where he least expected, it had truly made him a new man. One day, as they were walking through the town, Eleanor stopped and turned to Caleb, her eyes filled with a deep affection. I love you, Caleb, she said, her voice sincere. More than I ever thought possible. Caleb looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He had never expected to find love again, not after the tragedies he had endured. But here it was, standing before him, a gift he had never dared to hope for. I love you too, Eleanor, he said, his voice soft. They embraced, their connection a testament to the power of forgiveness, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unexpected paths that life sometimes takes. The threat of Eleanor's husband never fully disappeared, a constant shadow on the horizon. But redemption was ready. They had learned from their past. They had built a strong community, and they had found the courage to face whatever the future held. Caleb stood with Eleanor, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues. He finally understood that true wealth lies not in possessions, but in the bonds we forge and the communities we build. He knew that their journey would continue, that there would be more challenges ahead. But he also knew that they would face them together, side by side, bound by a shared past and a shared hope for the future. And that sometimes, the most unexpected alliances lead to the greatest redemption. The campfire crackled, casting dancing shadows on his weathered face. He looked out at the audience, his eyes holding a depth of experience that needed no further explanation. A slight nod, almost imperceptible, was his only acknowledgement. The story was told. The lesson, hopefully, learned.